Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Galen Barbos with Berkeley Labs Electricity Markets and Policy Group. I'll be presenting findings from the 8th and most recent edition of our annual Tracking the Sun report. Before launching into the presentation, though, let me just go over the standard housekeeping items. So you all are in listen-only mode. We will be having a Q&A session at the end, and so I just invite and encourage you to type in any questions that come up into the chat box that you see on the webinar console. My colleague Yo Seal is here and will be collecting the questions as they come in, and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the final 15-20 minutes or so of the hour. The webinar is being recorded, and we'll be posting a recording of the webinar along with the slides. That will be available at the website listed here on the title slide, trackingthesun.lbl.gov. At that web address, you can also find the report itself, along with a longer version of the PowerPoint briefing and an Excel file that contains tabular versions of all the figures in the report. Lastly, I would be remiss to not acknowledge my co-author, Naeem Dargouth, the many contributing authors to the report, the DOE Sunshot program for funding this work, and lastly, the many individuals and organizations that contribute data to this report. Without them, none of this would be possible. So thanks to all of you. And with that, let me launch in. So Tracking the Sun, as many of you may know, is an annual report and something of a reference document. Its primary purpose is to summarize trends in the installed price of PV systems in the US. Starting this year, we're focused exclusively on the residential and non-residential sectors. We have a separate annual report that focuses on the utility scale solar sector, and so we've just moved all of the utility scale data over to that report, and I'll say a little bit more about that on the next slide. Tracking the Sun is really fundamentally an historical, backwards-looking document. And so with this edition, we focus primarily on projects installed through the end of last year, with a bit of preliminary data for the first half of 2015. And the report can essentially be broken down into two main parts. The first part is focused on describing historical trends in national median prices, while the second part is focused on describing and understanding variability in system pricing, the spread in the data. Tracking the Sun is one element within a portfolio of ongoing research activities by both Berkeley Lab and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. We work quite closely with on a number of projects. So one other element in this portfolio, as I mentioned, is Berkeley Lab's annual utility scale solar report. This report provides historical data on the installed cost of utility scale PV and CSP, along with various other kinds of data, including performance data and power purchase agreement pricing data. Yo Seal, who is lurking in the background on this call, is one of the co-authors of that report, which is led by Mark Bollinger on our team. And the next edition of that LBL utility scale solar report should be coming out in the next few weeks, I believe. A second related work product that I want to mention is NREL's OpenPV project, which some of you are probably familiar with. This is an online data visualization tool that incorporates much of the same data that goes into Tracking the Sun. And indeed, we really undertake the data collection and cleaning for the two projects jointly. Third is an annual briefing called Photovoltaic System Pricing Trends. This is something that NREL and LBL jointly produce each year, and that really kind of synthesizes some of the high-level findings from Tracking the Sun and a number of other related research products. And then finally, listed on the slide here, we at LBL have been engaged over the past few years with researchers at a number of academic institutions, and that work it really involves leveraging the data set that we collect for Tracking the Sun and doing some kind of more advanced statistical analyses with that data in order to better understand PV pricing dynamics. And I'll highlight some of the key findings from that work on one of the later slides. So before delving into the results, let me just give a bit of background on the data sources and on some of the data control and data cleaning that precedes the analysis. And then I'll say a little bit about just the underlying data sample itself. So first, just to make sure we're all speaking the same language, tracking the sun is focused on the installed price of PV, which is to say the upfront dollar per watt price paid by the PV system owner, whether that's an individual homeowner or a commercial building owner or a third-party finance provider. And these are the prices paid prior to the receipt of any incentives or tax credits. As I mentioned, this year's Tracking the Sun focuses exclusively on residential and non-residential system. It's probably obvious what we mean by residential. By non-residential, we mean any roof-mounted system installed at a non-residential customer site, regardless of the size of the system, or ground-mounted systems up to 5 megawatts in size. So there are some potentially rather large systems included in this set that we call non-residential PV. And then there's utility scale PV, which is not included in this report, but that basically includes everything else, which is ground-mounted systems larger than 5 megawatts. And then lastly, just with respect to the units of analysis in this report, all the monetary data is denominated in real 2014 dollars, and system size and capacity data is expressed in DC, direct current terms. So the data for this report consists of individual project level data, which we collect primarily from state agencies and utilities that administer PV incentive programs, as well as SREC registration and interconnection processes. In total, there are about 50 such entities that contributed data to this year's report. There are then some other kind of supplementary data sources that we also draw from, though those are relatively minor in terms of their overall contribution to the sample. There are, and we try to be rather explicit and upfront about it, a number of limitations to these data sources. First, these are self-reported data by installers, and thus potentially prone to some amount of inconsistency in terms of how things are reported and the potential for human error. What we are reporting and what these data represent are transaction prices for systems that are sold to a site host or a third-party financer. And so this is different from the underlying cost borne by the developer or installer. Third, the data, as I've mentioned, are historical, focusing in this edition mostly on systems installed through 2014. And so given just how rapidly the U.S. solar market has evolved, these prices are already a little bit out of date relative at least to what's being quoted today for a prospective system. And then fourth and finally, we end up scrubbing out of our data a fairly sizable number of third-party owned or TPO systems. And I'll talk more about that on the next slide, but the key thing to note just from the context of data limitations is that these are essentially some of the largest installers in the country that end up getting removed from the final data sample. So this slide simply notes some of the basic data cleaning steps. I won't really dwell on these. I do just want to kind of skip down to the text box at the bottom to finish up this discussion about the removal of certain third-party owned systems. And the key distinction here is between integrated and non-integrated TPO systems. So integrated TPO systems are where you've got a single company that provides both the installation service and the customer financing. And in these cases, the prices that get reported to incentive programs are typically some sort of appraised value, since there's no system sale from which a transaction can be reported. And so these are the systems that we remove from the data sample. There are then non-integrated TPO systems where you've got two different companies, a customer finance provider and an installation contractor who sells the system to the finance provider. And in those cases, because there is an intermediate sale of the system, there's a transaction price that can be reported to the incentive programs. And so we've retained those systems in the analysis. And I'll show later how the prices reported for those systems compare to the prices that are reported for cash sale transactions where the system is sold to the site host. So our preliminary data sample prior to screening out any data observations consists of something like 400,000 systems installed through the end of last year. Comparing that to the total US residential, non-residential solar market, that's about 81% of all installed capacity cumulatively through the end of last year. And it includes about 62% of just what was installed last year. If you look at the bar charts in the figure, you can see that the sample coverage has eroded a little bit over the past 2 years, and that's primarily due to the end of the California Solar Initiative program. And so a decent portion of the California market over the past 2 years has resided outside of that incentive program and therefore outside of our data sample. Fortunately, the data collection process in California has now just very recently transitioned over to the utilities interconnection processes. And so hopefully going forward we won't really have this issue in future years, and we'll have a much closer to complete coverage of the California market. Aside from California, our sample coverage is also pretty thin for Hawaii, as just the data for that market aren't collected. At least not in a form that we can harvest. But beyond those two states, California and Hawaii, pretty much all the other major markets are well covered within our data sample. Now just this last bullet here, as I mentioned, we pull out the integrated TPO systems as well as several other categories of systems before performing our analysis. And that reduces our sample size down from above 400,000 to about 320,000. So that's basically the sample that we're working with throughout all of the figures that I'll be showing you in the next set of slides. There are a few characteristics of the data sample that are important to highlight before delving into the installed price trends. The first pertains to system size. This is shown in the set of charts at the top, and you'll note that we've segmented that data into 3 groups: residential, non-residential systems less than 500 kW, and non-residential systems greater than 500 kW. And this is kind of a standard segmentation that we use throughout the report. So you'll see on the upper left that residential system sizes have been growing steadily over time, reaching about 6.2 kW in 2014 in terms of the median system size. Similarly, on the upper right, median system sizes for the larger class of non-residential systems have also grown rather substantially over time, reaching about 1.1 megawatts in 2014. That middle group of systems, however, the non-residential systems less than 500 kW, those haven't really followed any steady temporal trend in terms of system sizes. And the key thing to note here is really that the median size for systems in that smaller non-residential group, sizes of those systems are kind of around 20 to 30 kW. So notwithstanding the fact that the upper bound is 500 kW, most of what resides within that middle group are rather small non-residential systems. The bottom set of figures on this slide show the sample distribution across states. Just really a couple important points to note here. The first is that although the sample includes systems across 42 different states, it's really quite heavily concentrated within 6 particular states: California, North Carolina, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, and Arizona. And among those 6, you can see that California has generally declined in share over time. That's partly a reflection of just the diversification of the US solar market, though also partly the result of the sample erosion in California that I mentioned. In any case, the important point to keep in mind as we look at trends in national system pricing is that those national trends are heavily dominated by pricing within these kind of 6 main states. So the last aspect of the data sample that I'll mention before moving into the installed price trends is just this distribution between customer-owned and third-party owned systems, and among the third-party owned systems between the integrated and non-integrated TPO models. So for both the residential and smaller non-residential sectors, you can see that the overall TPO shares, that's both the yellow plus the white portion of the graphics, that share grew quite rapidly from basically 2010 to 2012, and then plateaued at about 60% of the data sample consisting of TPO systems. And these are national numbers, and so the TPO shares in some individual states is much higher. Recalling again that we eventually screen out the integrated TPO systems, you can see that that subset of the initial data sample has continued to grow, the white portion, reaching roughly 40% of the sample for 2014 systems nationally, and quite a bit higher in some states, namely Arizona. And so those systems are getting ultimately screened out, as I mentioned. So those trends that I was just describing pertain to residential and small non-residential. For the larger non-residential systems on the right-hand side, the overall TPO share is a little bit smaller than for the other 2 segments, but the main difference to note there is that virtually all of those TPO systems are of the non-integrated variety, and so for that set of large non-residential systems, we really didn't have to screen many out. So that data sample is the final data sample there is closer to what the raw or preliminary data were. So with that, let's move into really kind of the substance of the report and the presentation, and focus first on historical trends in national median installed prices. If there's ever a need for a single figure for us to use as kind of emblematic of the report, this one is probably it. The figure here shows median installed prices over the full historical period available for each of the 3 customer segments. The first and most obvious observation here is just that the prices have declined quite substantially over the full historical period, shown with long-term average rates of decline between 6% and 12% per year, depending on the particular segment. That generally declining trend has, of course, kind of ebbed and flowed over time, and you can see, for example, that prices were relatively flat from about 2005 to 2009, but then starting in 2009, prices turned down rather steeply. That, as I will mention in a few slides, kind of corresponded to a period where PV module prices started falling rather rapidly. Just within the last year of this historical period, from 2013 to 2014, median prices fell by roughly 9% for residential, 10% for small commercial, and by more than 20% for the larger non-residential systems. And I'll talk more about some of the drivers for these trends in a couple slides. First, though, let me just finish up the basic description of how these prices have evolved and almost bring us up to the present. So this figure here includes data for systems installed within the first half of this year, 2015. It's drawn from a smaller set of states than the prior figure, though still includes most of the major markets. And the main story here is simply that price trends that we've observed in recent years seem to be persisting into 2015, though there certainly can be a little bit of volatility as we kind of look at things over shorter time increments. So kind of moving from description to some level of explanation, here we focus just on the residential market. The top line in green is the median installed price in each year. That's the same data we showed 2 slides ago. The blue line at the bottom is a module price index, and the orange line in between is simply the difference between the other 2 lines, which we refer to as the implied non-module costs. And there are essentially 2 main takeaway points here. The first is that the drop in installed prices over the period from roughly 2008 to 2012 was driven almost entirely by falling module prices. And you can see that by the kind of steep drop-off in the blue line over that period, and similar, though not exact, drop-off in the green line. Since 2012, however, module prices have been relatively flat, but installed prices, the green line, have continued to fall. And so by extension, we can say that that continued decline in installed prices is obviously associated with the drop in implied non-module costs, which you can see there with the orange line. Now, to be sure, what we're calling implied non-module costs is an aggregate of many, many things, and at least for our purposes here, that includes installer margins. So we can begin to unpack this decline in non-module costs, though admittedly this is only a partial unpacking. So just focusing on the last full year of the analysis period from 2013 to 2014, the collected set of non-module costs fell by roughly 40 cents per year, 40 cents per watt for residential systems. About 10 to 20% of that can be attributed to falling prices for inverters and racking equipment, kind of the main hardware elements embedded within non-module costs. The bulk of that 40 cent per watt reduction, however, is really due to a decline in the collected set of soft costs, which includes things like customer acquisition, installation labor, permitting, financing, etc. And for the purpose of this discussion, as I mentioned, installer margins or profit as well. Now, in thinking about the underlying causes for these soft cost reductions, there are 2 what I might call technical factors that we can readily quantify or estimate. The first is that, as we saw in one of the earlier slides, system sizes have gotten larger over time, which allows fixed project costs to be spread out over a larger number of watts. And so within just the last year of the analysis period, this increase in project size contributed to about 10% of the total decline in non-module costs for residential systems. The other technical factor is an increase in PV module efficiency. And that's what's shown in the chart on the slide here, where you can see kind of the steadily inclining median module efficiencies in the data sample. And that has, by increasing module efficiencies, you can kind of spread the area-related costs of a PV system out over a larger number of watts. And that dynamic has contributed to about 15% of the total non-module cost reduction. And then beyond those technical factors, you've got a number of kind of more diffuse and difficult to quantify causes. One is simply the widespread attention that has been turned on reducing soft costs, both within the industry and by policymakers. And then in addition, incentives have fallen quite substantially, and that's what this next slide focuses on. So here we see just how significantly state incentives have fallen over time. To be clear, this is really only one piece of the overall incentive pie, focusing here just on rebates and performance-based incentives. But historically, these have been really kind of one of the key levers for stimulating solar demand. And the figure here shows incentive levels in each of the largest programs, and you can see that at their peak about a decade ago, these programs were providing incentives kind of in the range of $5 to $7 per watt. But since then, those incentives have fallen to below $1 per watt, and in many cases, these incentives have gone away altogether. In part, these incentive reductions have been a response both to the decline in PV system prices and also the emergence of other forms of incentives. Certainly in some states, though, this ratcheting down of incentives has also really been a deliberate strategy to encourage further price reductions and to provide kind of a long-term signal to the market to reduce costs and improve efficiency. Regardless of this complex set of causes, I think one important point to note is that these incentive declines have offset to a fairly significant degree the system price reductions that have occurred over the same period of time. So far I've spoken mostly about the decline in installed prices over time, but haven't really said anything about installed prices in any absolute sense. Where are they? Within our data sample, median prices for systems installed in 2014 were roughly $4.30 a watt for residential systems, $3.90 for smaller non-residential, and $2.80 for larger non-residential systems. That's what's shown in the text box at the top of the slide here. Before taking those numbers and running with them, though, it's important to keep in mind that A, these are central tendencies, and there's quite a bit of pricing variability around those central values. B, these are national values, and as I mentioned, tend to be dominated by a small number of states that, as it happens, are also relatively high-cost states. And C, the underlying data have various limitations, as mentioned earlier, in terms of being historical and self-reported and excluding integrated TPO systems. And so rather than just putting the national median prices out there in a vacuum, one new element that we added to the report this year is to show how these median national prices line up against a number of other installed price and installed cost benchmarks out there. And that's what this figure shows. And so these other benchmarks, this is not a comprehensive set by any means, but these other benchmarks are kind of varied in nature, some modeled turnkey system prices, some price quotes, and then average costs reported directly by the two largest residential installers via their financial reports. And as it happens, these are kind of the two main installers who end up getting mostly removed from the data sample by virtue of being integrated TPO providers. Now, comparing between the LBL data and these other benchmarks, you can obviously see some differences and quite a bit of variability. It's safe to say that the median national prices drawn from the LBL data set are relatively high compared to most of these other benchmarks, at least for the residential and small non-residential markets, whereas for larger non-residential systems, the median price is pretty close to the other benchmarks. Now there are many reasons for why these prices can differ, and we've kind of listed some of them on the right-hand side. I won't really go through those sequentially or really at all, other just than to note that they're there. And I think just highlight kind of at the bottom line, the LBL data, really like any benchmark or data source, they have their merits and limitations and need to be kind of used within the context of what the data actually represent. I will just say though, in terms of how the LBL data line up against some of these other numbers, although the national medians appear somewhat high, as we'll see in the next section, there are really many instances within our data sample of systems that are much lower priced than these national medians and that do line up pretty well with some of these other benchmarks. So it just kind of depends on how you cut the data to a degree. So our focus is really on the United States. but it's helpful to see how prices in the U.S. compare to other major national markets. Here we compare 2014 system prices for residential and smaller non-residential systems across the set of countries shown here. I wouldn't necessarily place a huge amount of weight on the precise differences, just given how differences in how the data and methods the methods associated with each of these country prices. But the basic trend is that the prices in the U.S. are generally somewhat high compared to these other countries. Now, pricing for the main hardware components, modules, inverters, racking, etc., it can differ a bit from one country to another, partly as a result of import duties and other factors. However, those differences in hardware costs come nowhere close to the magnitude of the difference in overall installed prices that we see here. And so I think it's safe to say that the higher installed prices in the U.S. compared to most of these other countries is really primarily due to differences in soft costs. And in fact, there have been a number of studies that we've referenced here that kind of delve into those soft cost differences across countries. Now, these soft cost differences might partly reflect differences in the size of the markets in these different countries, and we illustrate that in rather simplistic terms via the green line, which shows cumulative distributed PV capacity in each country. The fact, though, that you've got some countries on the right-hand side with relatively low levels of deployment but also low prices indicates that there are clearly some other factors at play that help to explain the soft cost gap relative to the U.S. And those differences can help point the way towards further soft cost reduction opportunities in the U.S. So let's shift gears somewhat here and now go from talking about national median prices to looking at differences in prices across systems and across different geographies. And I'll just note that the material that I'll cover in this section is somewhat abbreviated relative to what's in the full report. I'm just going to hit on some of the high points and we'll leave it to you to look at the full report or the longer briefing that we posted online if you want to kind of delve into this material further. So the figure at the top of this slide shows the price distributions for systems installed in 2014. And as you can see, there's just a tremendous level of variability. So for example, among residential systems, the median price was $4.30 a watt, as I mentioned, but roughly 20% of the systems were below $3.50, and almost 10% were below $3 a watt. But then, of course, you've got at the other end of the spectrum systems that were up at $5.50, or even beyond. Now, there are many causes for this pricing heterogeneity, which we've identified here. Some of these causes we've explored through the kind of more in-depth statistical analyses with our academic partners, and some of them we've explored within Tracking the Sun itself. And I'll delve into a few of these potential causes of pricing heterogeneity in the next set of slides. Now, the top slide just shows a snapshot for 2014. The slide on the bottom kind of shows how pricing variability has evolved over time, and you can see, and we show that in terms of the gap between the 20th percentile and 80th percentile values in each year. And so you can see that there's been certainly a narrowing in pricing variability over time. There was a very pronounced narrowing that happened kind of in the late 1990s. In kind of the early formative years of the U.S. solar market. Things have stabilized a bit, though you can still see since about 2010 there has been this slow but steady narrowing of prices, and that's what we would kind of expect to see as the market matures and as competition increases among suppliers and installers and customers become better informed. So as I mentioned, we've undertaken some collaborations with a number of academic partners to kind of dig into the Tracking the Sun data with some more advanced statistical tools and methods. The slide here, which I'm actually going to kind of skip over, but I'll just note in passing that we've completed basically kind of 4 main studies so far. There are some others underway. And these studies all in various ways try to understand the impact of different factors on PV system prices, whether that's the impact of installer competition or installer experience, the impact of incentive levels, or the impact of kind of local permitting and regulatory processes. So those studies are available at the URL at the bottom of this slide if you're interested. So now when thinking about why prices might vary within the data sample, perhaps one of the first things to come to mind is that system sizes vary. And indeed there are quite significant economies of scale that arise even within each of the customer segments that are themselves distinguished based on size. And so the top figure shows residential systems where you can see kind of a drop-off between systems in the 2 to 4 kW range to systems in the kind of 8 to 10 kW range. That's where the most obvious economies of scale seem to materialize. And then on the bottom chart where we show non-residential systems, the economies of scale here, they arise more gradually, but since we're talking about such a huge range of system sizes from less than 10 kW on one end to larger than 1 megawatt on the other, the scale economies across that full width of system sizes are rather significant. Pricing differences across states are also significant. You can see that for residential systems in the top chart, with differences in state level medians from kind of at the low end, $3.40 a watt to $4.80 a watt at the upper end, and then kind of similar ranges for non-residential systems. Now it's worth just kind of pointing out something here that I asserted earlier and which we can now see, and that's that some of the largest state markets, namely California, Massachusetts, and New York, are also relatively high priced. And so naturally that tends to pull the national median price upward, and you can see that most states are below and well below in some cases the national median, which is shown by the dashed red line. Now these state level pricing differences might arise for various reasons, a level of competition in the local market, differences in incentive levels or permitting processes, even something as simple as sales taxes, which can add up to maybe 20 cents a watt to the total installed price, but are waived for PV systems in some states. One other potential source of pricing variability, whether we're talking about the data set as a whole or differences between states, might have to do with whether systems are customer-owned or third-party owned. Now recall that in the case of TPO systems, the data that we retain for this work are the dollar per watt prices paid to the installation contractor by the customer finance provider. So we're not talking about the lease rate or the PPA rate that the customer pays. That's an entirely different transaction. So the figure on the top shows the installed prices for TPO versus customer-owned systems over time for each of the 3 segments. Now there's kind of some interesting things going on where earlier in the time series the TPO systems are a little bit less expensive, and then later they're a little bit more expensive. But putting that to the side, I think really the more important takeaway point is that at least at a national level, the installed prices for TPO and customer-owned systems have been pretty similar. For some individual states, that hasn't necessarily been the case, and that's what the figure on the bottom shows. It's a little bit hard to know what conclusions to draw from that bottom slide. For some states, you can see that TPO systems were quite a bit less expensive than customer-owned. For 1 or 2 states, the opposite was the case, and then for some states, they were pretty similar. So I think maybe that just sort of kind of speaks to some of the idiosyncrasy in the data itself, though it's conceivable that there could be some kind of real differences in terms of TPO business models across states, or the particular TPO providers in different states that might be leading to some of these differences. Speaking of individual installers, another element, a new element added to this year's report was this comparison of pricing across installers. So this figure here, it's a little bit complicated, so let me just explain what we've done. We looked at 4 states, each of which were relatively large residential markets in 2014. And for each installer operating in those states, we computed the median price of residential systems that company installed in that state in 2014. And those installer level median values are what's shown here, kind of rank ordered from lowest to highest for each state. And so in doing this, we can see quite a bit of variation across installers. And so, for example, if you compare the 20th and 80th percentile values across these installer medians, you're looking at a difference of between $1.10 and $1.40 per watt, depending on the states. And so this is a really big part of the overall variability that we observe in the data set, kind of associated with differences in installer level pricing. Another important takeaway from this slide is that it kind of highlights what we might call low price leaders within each market that can potentially serve as a benchmark for what could be achievable in terms of installed price reductions more broadly. And so, for example, you can see in Arizona that there's a fairly sizable contingent of installers who have median prices less than $3 a watt, and that that compares to $4.30 a watt as the national median. So again, there's lots and lots of variability here. And then at the other end of the spectrum, of course, you've got some very high-priced installers, and that could be kind of indicative of any number of things, as we've indicated here. So now one potential explanation, I'm almost done here. So one potential explanation for installer level pricing differences is installer size. And the theory here is that larger installers might have some economies of scale and may have some greater efficiency gained through their accumulated experience. Now, some of the earlier econometric work that we've done with our academic partners did actually find some evidence of kind of an installer scale benefit, though the overall size of that effect was somewhat small, sort of about 20 cents per watt difference between the least experienced and most experienced installers. That was, again, something that we kind of found through an econometric analysis. When we look at the 2014 residential installations here, focusing on kind of on the same 4 states as on the previous slide, it's pretty hard to discern any clear relationship between installed price and system size. What we've done in the chart here is we've segmented the data according to the number of systems that the associated installer completed in 2014. And so you can see, for example, in Arizona and New Jersey, there's really no kind of clear difference in median system level prices across different installer volumes. And then for California and Massachusetts, there's kind of this odd trend where prices seem to be the highest for the mid-sized installers and lower for the smallest and the largest installers. I don't think that this figure really shuts the door on the theory that larger installers might be able to provide lower priced systems, though it does suggest that these effects probably are not huge and are certainly not the main source of installer level pricing differences. And it also kind of raises the possibility that there may be some countervailing factors at play. And so, for example, larger installers, although they may benefit from some economies of scale and improved efficiencies, they might also bear higher customer acquisition costs in order to maintain that volume. And so in the end, these things might maybe kind of cancel out, at least to some degree. Within Tracking the Sun, there are a number of other kind of cross-sectional comparisons that we provide that among other things, help to explain some of the overall pricing variability that we see. I've just listed those here. Unfortunately, we don't have time today to cover all that material, but I thought I'd just kind of mention them, and if any of these specific items pique your interest, please feel free to take a look at the report, and we kind of have a section dedicated to each of these trends identified on the slide. I'll just end with some high-level conclusions, or maybe more like summary points. The first is that over the long run, it's clear that installed prices for residential and non-residential PV have fallen quite substantially in the U.S., with perhaps some acceleration in those trends since about 2008 or 2009. That acceleration was initially driven by module pricing and a steep drop in module pricing. But since about 2012, module prices have generally flattened, but system prices have continued to fall. And that's really marked kind of a transition to a new era where PV system price reductions are now really kind of coming largely from reductions in non-module costs and mostly from soft costs, some of which might be a compression of installer margins. In general, I think this is a positive story, and it lends some credence to all of the emphasis and effort that has been placed on reducing soft costs in recent years, and suggests that those efforts have begun to bear some fruit. All that said, it's also clear that there's still a lot of room for further price declines, and that's evident both when we compare the U.S. to other countries, as well as when we just look within the U.S. and compare across states or across individual systems. And so it's probably safe to assume that although some further soft cost reductions will inevitably occur just naturally as the market grows and matures, it's also probably safe to assume that market size alone is not going to bridge that gap in its entirety, and that some amount of kind of targeted, whether policy-driven or industry-led initiatives will be needed in order to really expedite the process of reducing soft costs. So with that, let me just thank you all for your attention. Listed here is some information on where you can go to find further information, as well as some contact info. And with that, I apologize, we only have maybe about 10 or 11 minutes left, but I know Yo has been collecting your questions in the background, and Yo, I'll turn it over to you to kind of relay some of those questions to me.
Yeah, thank you very much, Galen, for this wonderful presentation. We have a few questions coming in, although there might be a little bit more space for the questions. So if you have any more, please keep them coming. One issue that has been raised a couple of times was a question about microinverters and whether or not they are included in your data sample and how the pricing might differ from other regular string inverters, and in addition, whether other power electronics or batteries have been included in this microinverter subsample or not.
Okay, sure. Those are good questions. Systems with microinverters are included in the data sample, and in fact, as you may have noticed on the kind of next to last slide where we listed some of the other comparisons in Tracking the Sun, one of them actually has to do with microinverters specifically. And so we do compare the price of systems with microinverters to those with kind of standard string or central inverters, and don't find really huge pricing differences. I mean, maybe it's a little bit kind of volatile from year to year or segment to segment, but you're kind of looking at differences in installed prices that are roughly of the same magnitude as the differences in just the price of a microinverter versus a standard inverter, maybe somewhat less. And so it's conceivable that there could be some savings in kind of other BOS costs associated with microinverters that might kind of offset some of the price premium. So you also asked about DC optimizers and batteries. So systems with DC optimizers are also included in the data set. Unfortunately, we don't really have much information that allows us to identify those systems, so we haven't been able to parse them out or do any analysis around them. It would be great to be able to do so, but it just requires that that information is kind of collected by incentive programs, and that thus far generally doesn't happen. So it does happen in some cases. In terms of battery backup systems, we actually exclude those systems from the sample. We've toyed with leaving them in and doing some analysis around them, but so far there just aren't really enough systems to make that worthwhile. I would anticipate, though, that as we start to see more systems with batteries, we probably will begin retaining those systems, and we'll be trying to kind of slice and dice the data to see what kind of installed pricing differences that might lead to.
Okay, great. We had a couple of other questions pertaining to integrated third-party ownership systems. You excluded them for the main part of this analysis, but one person was asking whether you could nevertheless comment on some kind of price development in that integrated third-party owned sector. I believe there's an appendix in the report for concrete data, but maybe you could give an overview.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I think, I guess one important point to maybe just reiterate is whether we're talking about integrated or non-integrated TPO systems, none of the data that we collect really say anything about the prices that customers are paying in terms of the lease rate or the PPA rate. Perhaps there's some relationship with those prices, but we don't have any kind of ability to observe those prices, at least within the data that we collect for this work. So there's kind of no comment on that issue, but as I kind of mentioned in some of the introductory slides, integrated TPO systems, they do report dollar per watt numbers to incentive programs, and just by necessity, they have to report some sort of appraised value since there's no system sale through which a transaction price is realized. So we've excluded those systems just for the simple reason that appraised values are not the same thing as transaction prices, and we don't want to kind of mix apples and oranges to the extent that we can avoid it. As Yo mentioned, we do in the appendix, just as sort of for kind of methodological reasons and for those that really like to geek out on the data, we do include a figure just comparing the prices that are reported for integrated TPO and non-integrated TPO systems. For the integrated TPO systems, we don't use those data anywhere else. We just include it in that figure just as a kind of point of comparison so you can see what would have happened had we included them. What you see is that when you compare integrated to non-integrated TPO prices that are reported to incentive programs, the prices that are reported by the integrated TPO providers at some earlier point in time tended to be higher, but they've since kind of converged. And as I understand it, there have just been some changes in the way that kind of the integrated TPO providers are calculating appraised values for the purpose of what they report to incentive programs. So in the end, actually, our decision to exclude those integrated TPO systems is kind of immaterial, at least as far as the last couple of years goes, just given that their prices are actually pretty similar to the non-integrated ones, but we still nevertheless have continued to exclude them just kind of on the principle of trying to minimize the amount of apples and oranges that get combined.
Yeah. Maybe a related question to that. One listener raised the issue whether or not the exclusion of such TPO systems in the economies of installer scale, so to speak, would have any skewing effect on your results there. Can you comment on that?
Yes, that is a great question. So when we calculated each installer's annual volume, we included any integrated TPO systems. Now, when we calculated kind of median prices, of course we excluded those, but just for the purpose of kind of bucketing the systems according to installer volume, those buckets were based on both integrated and non-integrated TPO systems. But that's a good question and something we had to make sure we handled appropriately.
Okay, great. Thank you for that clarification. One other question that was raised was whether you can elaborate a little bit more how higher efficiency modules, which one could think of maybe more expensive, contribute in the end to lower dollar per watt cost.
Sure, yeah, and that's a good question and actually touches upon one of the other kind of comparative analyses that is included in the report but that I didn't have a chance to get to here. And so we do kind of look at sort of the distribution of module efficiencies within our data sample and try to understand and compare system prices based on the efficiency of the modules that are being used. And what we see within the overall samples that there's of course a very wide distribution in module efficiencies. It's kind of a binomial distribution, a bimodal distribution, and so there's a lot of systems with efficiencies kind of centered around kind of 15, 16% efficiency, and then another bunch that are kind of clustered around 19% or so, and that's basically polycrystalline versus monocrystalline systems. Comparing the installed prices of sort of high efficiency versus mid/low efficiency module systems, the prices for high module efficiency systems are quite a bit higher. From one perspective, maybe that's not surprising given that the modules themselves are more expensive. In theory, more efficient modules allow you to save on balance of system costs, and so in theory one might expect those two things to balance out. But at least within our particular data sample and based on the kind of specific module manufacturers and models that are represented there, and that offsetting is clearly not complete because the higher efficiency systems are quite a bit more expensive. I actually can't recall the kind of the delta off the top of my head, but it's not insignificant.
Okay, thank you. It is now 12 o'clock. Do you want to conclude the seminar here?
I think we do, unfortunately, need to, since I think this will just end on its own accord at the top of the hour. So let me just thank all of you for attending, and for those that asked questions, thank you. For those that asked them but whose questions weren't answered, my apologies. But again, feel free to email me if you'd like. And of course, feel free to download documents and sign up for our mailing lists and all of those other good things that allow us to transmit information to you freely. So thank you all, and until next time.